Hi, everybody. Thanks for logging in. I think we're ready to get started, and we may have some folks join us as we go along. I know how that goes when it's in the middle of our day. So welcome, everyone. If you want to ask questions, you can certainly do that in the chat section, and I will try to answer them as we go along. I often say that if you're anything like me, that question lasts about 3 seconds, and then I forget it. So asking you to wait till the end doesn't always work. So as long as we have time for that, we'll go ahead and I'll go ahead and answer the questions throughout, so that if anybody needs any more clarification, we'll be on topic at the time. So this webinar is called Putting the Puzzle Pieces Together, and it's about orientation and gender identity. And the reason I've chosen the puzzle pieces is because I find that that's how most people come to this conversation. They have some of the puzzle pieces, but not all of them. And then even the ones they do have, oftentimes they're not sure how those all fit together. And so hopefully today that'll give you a breakdown and some education about terminology, as well as the intersectionality of each of the parts that make up our sexuality. For the first concept, I think that it's important to cover is despite where you come to this conversation, there is room for you as an ally in your practice in terms of helping the LGBTQ folks across Nebraska. And so I think most of us come to the conversation, we're a little hesitant to be that outspoken ally because we don't think that we know enough. And so I think that as long as you're asking questions and your heart is in the right place, you'll find that there is room for you to be whatever type of ally you would like to be. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Joni Stacy, and I've been practicing family law and estate planning in Omaha for over 20 years. And this issue of LGBTQ folks and serving them is my passion. So I do presenting, training, and consulting in Omaha regionally and around the country. And it is certainly where my passion lies. So we'll go ahead and get started quickly. And the first concept that we're going to talk about is the concept of what does it mean to be binary. So if we're talking about any concept that exists on a binary for folks that aren't IT folks like me, that concept of binary means that whatever you're talking about consists of only two options and exactly two options. And that's oftentimes how we come to this topic, especially about sexual orientation and gender identity, thinking that there's just two. So we look at the world like the screen, very black and white. You're either gay or straight, you're either transgender or not, and that is the entire story. When in reality, when we look at human beings, if we were to ask, is everyone one of two things? And we think about things like, hair color, eye color, skin color, all of those things, we realize that a binary concept of those things doesn't fit. So if we're talking about people, is everybody either a blonde or a brunette? Is everyone black or white, healthy or ill, blue-eyed or brown-eyed, able-bodied or disabled, short or tall, heavy or thin, right-handed or left-handed, young or old? We all know that it doesn't exist like that. It isn't a dichotomy or a binary concept for folks, so that our human condition fits neatly into those two little boxes. And the best way that I've heard it talked about is through Neil deGrasse Tyson, and hopefully you're all familiar with him. He's very funny. And so he kind of explains our situation and our need to see things or to try to categorize them in a black and white situation when that doesn't always work. So if you need to, we've checked the volume, so you may need to turn it up a little bit on your computers or your speakers to hear it.
So it's a very human thing to say, is it this or is it that? Is it a planet? Is it not a planet? Is it less filling or is it great taste? Is it gum or is it candy? These are sort of false dichotomies. Something can be both, but our language forces us to require that it fit into one word or another. Okay. What we're not recognizing is that it's not a fault of the object or the concept. It's a defect in our language. And if our thoughts follow language, we have trouble thinking of things that fit more than one category. I think that's the source of most human ailments in the world.
Yes, it is.
Cultural ailments. Are you gay or are you not gay?
Right.
Are you black or are you not? Are you this or are you that? Are you female? Are you? And it's like, chill out. Just let things be what they are. Allow there to be a spectrum in all that we see.
So that doesn't necessarily just mean broadening language, but broadening the way the human mind thinks.
I think that once you learn language, the language shapes how you think more than your thoughts shape what language does. It takes a very creative person to start inventing words for thoughts that they had for which no words applied.
And so hopefully we'll come away from this conversation realizing that, particularly when we're talking about human beings, that the view of the world of being black and white isn't really how people come to us, and that really it is a situation of a lot of gray and a very little bit of black and white on the sides. And we can't really have this conversation without being a little more cognizant of how bias comes into this conversation. And so when we think about bias, there's some common thinking about bias that most of us bring to the conversation. And that is a couple of things. One is that there's good people in this world and that there are bad people in this world. And the good people have no biases and the bad people have all of them. And that is how we've had the conversation about bias, so that none of us really want to have a conversation about biases that we have that we're aware of, because nobody wants to be a bad person. Nobody wants to be considered a bad person. So we oftentimes just shove those aside and don't really deal with them, address them, or even admit them to ourselves, because nobody wants to be a bad person. So what we need to do is a little paradigm shift about biases and realizing that, spoiler alert, we all have them. And so if we all have them, it doesn't make good and bad people. It just means that we need to be aware of them, and if we ever hope to address them and make them any different. So when we talk about biases, there's actually two kinds of bias. We have conscious biases that we're aware of and unconscious biases that we're unaware of. So when we talk about conscious bias, there are different levels of that conscious bias. So personal bias is a private, internally held bias that we have. And so I oftentimes talk about an innocuous one, and that is that I hate Brussels sprouts. I don't even know if I've ever eaten one, but I worked in a restaurant where we called them turtle heads, and they're kind of dead to me. The reason I talk about that is because it doesn't harm anyone. Those personal biases that we have, if we don't act on them, they don't hurt anyone. So it's not that we can't work on them or be more aware of them, but we need to be aware of when those personal biases start adversely impacting other people, and that's when it becomes an interpersonal bias. So examples of interpersonal bias are email forwards, name calling, ostracization. Those are times where we take a personal bias and we bring more people into the fold. And that really can start adversely impacting all kinds of folks. And then when we have institutional biases, that is when enough people get together with an interpersonal bias and we start to institutionalize them in terms of them becoming part of our laws and our policies. And that absolutely adversely impacts people. So for this group that we're talking about today, the LGBTQ community, we think of things like the so-called DOMA, Don't Ask, Don't Tell, or I'm sorry, DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act that was overturned in 2013 and then finally overturned completely in 2015. And we also think about things like Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So those are things that started out as somebody's personal bias, enough people get together with that bias, and then we started to institutionalize them. So we're trying to work our way back through those and unwind some of those, but there's still a long way to go. And then, more importantly, and the part that most of us don't talk about because we're not even aware of them, are our unconscious or implicit biases. And those are the ones that are under the radar. We're not even necessarily aware of them unless we go out of our way to discover those. So when we think about how we process the world, we encounter 11 billion bits of information each moment of the day. And a moment is about a minute and a half. So that is just getting bombarded with bits of information that we have to sort out and categorize. But we can only consciously process about 40 of those bits of information every moment, which means then that 99.999996% of all of this processing is done unconsciously. So it behooves us to figure out what our unconscious biases are, because they're playing a huge role in how we react to people, and we're not even aware of them. We're certainly aware of our conscious biases, but we can't be, by definition, aware of our unconscious biases. And so this, hopefully, if you can take this, so this is an awareness test, and we hope certainly as lawyers that we're particularly aware of what's going on, and certainly hope you can all count. So we'll go ahead and watch this. We'll see what your answers are.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
I'm not sure how many of you got this answer. And so sometimes we hear, somewhere between 12, 13, 14. So hopefully you got somewhere at least close to that.
Answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Go!
So that's a great example of us thinking that we're aware and we're paying attention to what's surrounding us and what's around us. And in reality, we're missing the big moonwalking bear right in the middle of our face. And we can't be expected to understand and appreciate those things that we miss if they're not part of our radar. So how do those become more conscious in terms of our bias and our awareness of them? The best way I have found is through these Harvard implicit bias tests. So this has been tested and retested in many universities across the country. And I will tell you that if you haven't taken them, when you do, I can save you the energy of trying to rationalize with the test of why, particularly as a lawyer, you must have read the questions wrong, or read more into them than other people, because the results are not always attractive. And so one of the things that I decided a long time ago that I would be honest about is that I took the implicit bias test on race. And unfortunately, it shows that I have a slight preference for white people. And I was not happy as a social justice advocate who spends pretty much every waking moment on social justice issues whenever I can. I didn't want to know that. I didn't want to hear that. I didn't want to believe it. But the reality is that the environment in which I've lived in my whole life has been relatively segregating. And at least my early childhood was, until I started to make conscious decisions to diversify my world. And so I think we all need to be aware of it. And all of those different topics are available. Super easy to find. You don't need the exact website. If you just Google it, it'll come up. But as unfun as it is to find out those things about yourself, it's really important that we don't go through life unaware of our implicit biases, because they are impacting our reactions to folks, whether we want to admit it or not. And so when we talk about orientation and gender identity, now that we've talked about kind of what gets in the way of that conversation, the best way I've seen this kind of broken down for folks, and I've been able to educate folks all over the country about this, is to think about the sexuality, our sexuality, in terms of separate graphs. And so those graphs are made up of our biology, our gender identity, our gender expression, and our sexual orientation. So we'll go through all four of those, and we'll go through those separately, and then we'll have a conversation about how they all meet back in the middle. So the first one then is our biology, and that's the makeup of our anatomy, chromosomes, and hormones. And most people think of this conversation as just it being quite a binary. Remember, we said only two options. You look between a baby's legs when they're born, you assign them male or female, and that's the end of the story. And I don't know how many of you are aware of what we all start out as in terms of fetuses, in terms of sex, but we all start out as females. So I oftentimes tease that that's because we're the far superior sex. And then guys would say they got an upgrade. So that's not why we talk about it. We talk about it because it's all the same tissue. So the same tissue that developed into ovaries into me as a female-bodied person are testes in a male. The clitoris is the same thing as the tip of the penis. It's all the same tissue. So during that period of gestation, it shouldn't surprise us that there are times when parts are masculinized, some parts are masculinized, and some parts aren't. And for those folks where that happens, they're considered to have intersex conditions. So those intersex conditions can be a part of your anatomy, so your internal or external reproductive organs, or they can be part of your chromosomes or hormones. And one of the most common questions then, once folks understand what intersex conditions are, is they want to know how often it happens. So we don't have any exact numbers in terms of how frequently folks are born with intersex conditions, but we do kind of have ranges. There are 1 in 100 infants that have bodies that differ from standard male and female. So again, that has to do with external reproductive organs only, because that's all that's visible at birth. We can't look into somebody's insides, and we can't look at their hormones and chromosomes at birth. And then there are between 1 in 1,500 and 1 in 2,000 infants that have such noticeably atypical genitalia that a specialist is brought in. And then only about 1 or 2 in 1,000 receive surgery to quote unquote normalize genital appearance. Now, all 3 former surgeons general just came out in the last week or 2 with a report basically advising against any surgeries unless they're medically necessary for any baby who's born with an intersex condition. Because what we have found over time is that if you don't make that decision about deciding whether or not you're going to make it look more like a vagina or a clitoris or more like a penis, is that then you can advise those parents, maybe ask them or encourage them to pick a gender neutral name, and then wait until that child is old enough to be able to identify in terms of what their brain tells them they are in terms of a gender. And then if you have to do surgery, then you know what you're doing. You know which way to try to make the outer anatomy look to match what's going on the inside. And that's been best practices policy from the American Medical Association for years now. And so more and more people in terms of medical providers are understanding and appreciating the importance of waiting. And then, as we've talked about, the 1 in 100 only has to do with those external reproductive organs. And so it's important to remember that the vast majority of those intersex conditions happen internally. There's about 70 of those internal intersex conditions that have to do with somebody's anatomy hormones and or chromosomes. And when we look at the animal kingdom, there are lots of interesting differences in terms of sex in the animal kingdom as well. So the first one, talk about is seahorses. I would love to have that take on, but I'm not going to hold my breath. But very interesting dynamic that we don't have in humans. And then there are lots of animals. This is not an exhaustive list, but there are lots of animals that have more than 2 sexes, or what they call morphs in the animal kingdom. So for example, the coho salmon and the red deer both have 3 distinct sexes, 1 female and 2 male. And then the white-throated sparrow has 4, so they have 2 distinct female and 2 distinct male sexes. The side-blotched lizard has 5 different sexes or morphs, so they have 3 distinct male sexes and 2 distinct female sexes. And the golden hamlet, they're an interesting little fish. So there are more than 25,000 species of fish, and there are only 40 of that whole 25,000. Only 40 of those species are simultaneous hermaphrodites, and the golden hamlet is an example of that. And what that means is they have both complete male and female sex organs, and they can actually have sex in any given day as both a male and a female. So they're quite busy apparently. And then another interesting fish are the spotlight parrotfish. And so for the spotlight parrotfish, they are all born female, and their coloring is red and black and white. And then some of them become male over time. And if they do, their complete coloring changes, and they become kind of an emerald green and with some pinks in terms of their coloring. And then my favorite is this one, and that's the clownfish, and not just because it's Nemo, who doesn't love Nemo, but because of the interesting way that they organize their schools. So in clownfish schools, they have one and only one female who mates with the largest male in that school. And then when something happens to that female, that largest male becomes female and starts mating with the next largest male. So they're actually changing their sex based on the needs of their school as time goes on. Fascinating. The next one, so the second one that we'll talk about, second graph, is our gender identity. And that's our internal sense of self, or what our brain tells us we are. And again, most folks, hopefully not all, but there are still a lot of folks that think of this as a binary concept, meaning there's exactly and only two choices. You either identify as a man or a woman. And then for some folks, in terms of their gender identity, they would identify as non-binary or third gender. And those folks would say that those boxes in terms of man and woman don't really fit for them. They don't neatly fit into one or the other. Third gender is really common in some other countries in terms of a gender, and actually has gained legal status in about 6. And I meant to refresh my memory before we started, but I know that Australia, New Zealand, Canada's in the process, and so is Germany, but there's some other countries as well that are allowing folks to identify as third gender in terms of the sex on their legal documents. So we need to keep paying attention for that and hoping that it gains some ground in the United States. And then those folks who would identify as gender fluid or gender queer, gender fluid generally describe their lived experiences as feeling like they are fluid in between the gender identity of a man and a woman. And then gender queer, similar to fluid, but sometimes that's at the same time, feeling a sense of both. And then those folks who would identify as agender would say that they don't identify with the sex they were assigned at birth, but they don't match any other one either in terms of their gender identity. They feel like they are genderless or without a gender. And so when we think about sex and gender, for those of us, and that's most of us, whose the sex that we were assigned at birth or our anatomy match our gender identity, don't think anything about the difference between the words sex and gender, and we often use them very interchangeably. And for most folks that works, but when we're talking about trying to differentiate between somebody's anatomy and somebody's gender identity, or their biology and their gender identity, and we're using the terms of sex and gender, we generally think of sex in terms of someone's anatomy, and that their gender's in their brain or their gender identity. And so it is important sometimes, if you have forms or you're having conversations about insurance, that there are legal statuses in terms of somebody's sex, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's the gender they identify with. So it's important to be comfortable asking both of those questions and understanding that it's not the same for everyone. So when we talk about the relationship between biology and gender identity, if somebody is assigned male at birth and they identify as a man, or they're assigned female at birth and they identify as a woman, they're considered cisgender. So CIS is the word for on the same side of. So that means their anatomy or their biology and their gender identity match. So if someone is assigned male at birth and their gender identity is anything but man, or somebody is assigned female at birth but their gender identity is anything but woman, they are considered transgender. And so most folks, if they're familiar with the term transgender, think of it specifically as a term relating to somebody transitioning from one gender to the other. And it is that, but it is also an umbrella term that encompasses far more identities than just that. And so when we think about it as an umbrella term, and we talk about terms relating to somebody's gender identity, then, and that means that the sex they were assigned at birth does not match their gender identity. You might hear the term transsexual. Not a big fan of that word. It's a little bit older. Not that there aren't folks that still self-identify that way. There just aren't as many, and certainly not as many youth. And for a couple of reasons. One is it's got that 3-letter word sex in it, and gets people thinking about orientation and gender identity. Gets people thinking about orientation and sexual behavior that have nothing to do with your gender identity. And the other reason is it was originally coined for folks who'd had surgery. So it started to take on kind of a hierarchical sense in terms of the fact that it would be, oh, she's transsexual or I'm transsexual, meaning that they've actually had surgery. And folks felt like it wasn't really honoring somebody who's transgender, but either doesn't want or can't have it. It doesn't have access to surgery. And so the more common term when we talk about somebody transitioning is the term transgender. And then you might hear F to M, M to F, trans man, trans woman. And you'd love to help, but you have no idea what's going on. So it's important to remember is whatever is last is how they identify, and that's where they're transitioning or how their gender identity exists in their brain. So M to F means that they were assigned male at birth and identify as female. It's the same thing as a trans woman. So whatever's last is how they're identified, and that's where they're transitioning. Folks that identify as gender fluid don't just match the sex they were assigned at birth, but they actually match the other one as well. And so they really feel like they are, in terms of their gender identity, fluid in between both man and woman. And then those folks that are identify as gender queer, kind of the same thing. They can identify in terms of either feeling like a little bit of both or different on different days. There's lots of different ways that folks identify. When they identify as gender queer, it's not just one little box. And then non-binary folks and third gender folks, remember again, would be those folks who don't fit neatly into those packages of feeling like they're a man or a woman in terms of their gender identity, and that they don't exist on that binary concept. And then we have agender folks who are also under the umbrella, because remember, they don't match the sex they were assigned at birth, but they don't match any other gender either. When we talk about types of transition, a social transition is available to a person at any age, and they're really changing their outer appearance or their gender expression, the way that the world sees them, to match their gender identity. And so we're talking typically about presence and absence of facial hair or makeup, hairstyles, and clothing. Those are the main ways that folks will show a social transition. And then a medical transition is available to anybody at any age as long as they've reached the age of puberty. And what a medical transition does is it supplements a social transition with some type of medical intervention. And that can mean hormone blockers to stop the wrong puberty. It can mean the introduction of hormone replacement so that the person goes through the correct puberty that matches their gender identity. And then there's all different kinds of surgery. So it's important to know that not everybody wants or has access to all of those. And so when it comes to somebody's desire for surgery or any kind of medical intervention, is really related to their what we call body dysphoria, or their level of discomfort with the body that they were born with. And so some folks understand and appreciate that they're transgender in terms of their brain, but they don't have any need for any kind of medical intervention to change the body that they have. And so there are as many ways to be transgender as there are transgender people. There's no one way to be transgender. There are also folks then that are transgender that wish they could have the surgery the day before yesterday, but don't have access, either financially or through insurance, to make any of that happen. And then the third graph that we'll talk about is our gender expression. And that is, and I alluded to it in the last slide, your gender expression is the way that you communicate your gender to the world. So we do it in those obvious ways like clothing, hairstyle, presence and absence of facial hair and makeup. But we do it in more subtle ways too. So we have our tone and pitch of voice, our gait, tattoos, piercings, all of those things communicate our gender to the world. And this seems to be the one graph where people truly appreciate the fact that it's not a binary concept, because most of us don't exist at either end of masculinity or femininity exclusively, and that we're somewhere in that graph, but not necessarily at polar opposite ends of the masculine or feminine end. And so then again, those folks that in terms of their gender expression or gender fluid are sometimes expressing themselves more masculinely and sometimes more femininely. And then gender queer folks, sometimes they mix that together. And so you might have someone with facial hair wearing a skirt. And so there's a sense of masculinity and a sense of femininity in the same gender expression. And then androgynous and gender neutral folks, those are folks that are presenting in the middle so that you can't tell just by looking at them if their presentation is masculine or feminine. It's really in the middle there. And so when we think about these three concepts together, what's important to note is that all of them are biologically based. So we don't have anything to say about the sex that we're assigned at birth, or our gender identity, or really where we're most comfortable in terms of our gender expression. Now, we move our gender expression around, certainly. I'm most comfortable in, comfy pants and a sweatshirt, but they won't let me show up in court in those. I can get dressed up. It's just not my favorite thing. I love jewelry because it always fits, but I will never be typically in heels. I don't wear dresses and skirts. I know that we renamed pantyhose tights, but I still hate them. So that's where I'm most comfortable in my gender expression, even though clearly I can go outside that box. But that's where I am in terms of my comfort level. But what's particularly unique about gender expression is that that's the one that's culturally defined. So we're making the rules about that. So when I indicate where I am in terms of my gender expression, I would probably be somewhere between that masculine and feminine, more towards the feminine side than the masculine, but really not all the way to the end of feminine. But that's today. And if that was 50 or 70 years ago, I would have been between gender fluid and masculine, because I wore pants and I wear suit jackets and I have a really short haircut, and all of those things would have been considered extremely masculine at that point in time, even though it doesn't anymore. And so when we think about the stereotypes that make up femininity, oftentimes I will ask groups or audiences to name those things that we stereotypically consider extraordinarily feminine. And so since we're not in an interactive setup today, I'll just go ahead and give you the answers. But I think you'll find that it's really common. So certainly, really long frilly dresses and nail polish and high heels and gotta have your bling. Princess, that it's some person who we would just identify as a princess, and makeup. And then the most stereotypical feminine expression would be Barbie, that we apparently can't recreate an actual human being. And so most of us aren't that. Most of us are somewhere along the graph in some fashion, but not so feminine we're about to fall off the feminine into that graph. So by the same token, when we talk about the stereotypes of masculinity, so masculine, there's no room for anything else. What are the things that come top of mind that are those stereotypes of masculinity? We have muscles and sports cars, and sorry about that, but a lot of back hair, and all things sports, and facial hair, and our voice. So James Earl Jones has probably the most masculine voice of our time. And that is definitely, we think of as a sign of masculinity. And so the ultimate in that is caveman. And again, most masculine representation isn't so masculine that it's caveman. It's somewhere in that graph that we find our kind of sweet spot, or where we are most naturally. And as we already mentioned, gender expression does change over time. So when we look at this little boy from 1870, pretty feminine outfit. So pleated skirt, patent leather shoes, Sunday best hat. And I don't know if anybody of you are familiar with who this is, with a very fancy outfit and hat and shoes. It's former President FDR. And that's just how you dressed little boys then. And you didn't typically cut a little boy's hair until they were about 7. And so you'd see lots of those long locks of hair. That was just typical at the time. This is a boy paper doll set from 1910. I'd say by today's standards, the doll's pretty feminine, and about half of the outfits are. And then we have a boy paper doll set in the 1920s. I would say by today's standards, the doll's pretty feminine, and all of the outfits are. So then when we look at the transgender umbrella, and we go back to that umbrella, but we're talking about the terms related to somebody's gender expression. You might hear things like gender nonconforming or gender variant when it comes to children. Those are clinical terms typically used by psychiatrists. But those of us who do work with kiddos prefer terms like gender creative, gender expansive, or gender independent. Gender fluid, then, remember, those are folks in terms of their gender expression that are sometimes expressing more masculinely and sometimes more femininely. And then gender queer folks might mix that up. And then cross-dressers, generally but not always straight men. And the only reason I say that, and the only reason they're part of this umbrella, if you think about it, in terms of typically being straight men, is because women cross-dress all the time and no one cares. And so some of this, especially when we talk about gender expression, we need to think about our stereotypes and cultural expectations of these gender roles and what a huge part that plays in terms of the fact that in our society we can always okay to be more masculine to a point, but not okay to be more feminine. And then drag kings and drag queens are those that cross-dress but for entertainment reasons. And then those folks who present androgynously are under the transgender umbrella because they're not presenting in terms of their gender expression to match the sex they were assigned at birth or any other one because they're appearing gender neutrally. So when we look at that umbrella and we look about that there's terms related to somebody's gender identity and there are certain ones that are related to gender expression. And it's important to know the difference because they're not the same thing in terms of gender identity versus gender expression. So it's important to understand that those are in different categories. So if you're out in public and you can't figure out a stranger's gender, this list is the best list I've come across in almost 10 years that I've been doing this in terms of what steps to follow if you don't understand a stranger's gender and you can't figure it out. That's the whole list. That's it. Just don't worry about it. It's really the only thing that we need to know. So the fourth graph then that we'll talk about is orientation. And so hopefully you figured out at this point that this graph means that it's probably not a binary concept and not everybody is only attracted to men or only attracted to women. There are folks who identify as bisexual, and that means they're attracted to both men and women. Does not mean equally. They could be more attracted to men than women or vice versa. They could be attracted to masculinity or femininity. To dispel the myths right now, does not involve groups of people. They may have more fish in their sea, but it does not mean they're swimming with all of them. Pansexual is a cousin term to bisexual, and those folks are really attracted to all identities. So they wouldn't care if you were transgender or had an intersex condition. They are searching for a soulmate, and so the outer packaging doesn't really matter. The best way I've heard it described is that it's hearts, not parts. Then someone who identifies as asexual doesn't really have any physical attraction to any gender. Does not mean that they can't or won't have sex. It's just not the same for them, and some of them don't. And then demisexual is a cousin term to the asexual, and they also don't have really a physical attraction to folks, but they can develop that physical attraction if their emotional and romantic relationship is strong enough. And certainly asexual people can have romantic and emotional, strong relationships with folks. It's just not physical. And so then demisexual, the same thing, but they can develop those physical attractions if the relationship is strong enough. When we look at same-sex pairings in the animal kingdom, just as we looked at the differences in terms of sexes or morphs in the animal kingdom, we see more than 1,500 species that have same-sex pairings, and some of those mate for life, just as humans do, and some don't, just as humans do. And so some of them, like penguins in particular, they tend to mate for life, and maybe they do the same thing we do and they intend to, and it doesn't always work out. I don't know, I haven't asked any of them. But the observations are that some of them do mate for life. When you look at all of it together, there's a few really important concepts that we need to keep in mind. And so the first one is that the term is not transgendered with an ED on the end. This hasn't happened to them. Just as I haven't been straightened and my gay friends haven't been gay, they have not been transgendered. It's just transgender, and it's an adjective. The term is transitioning. No one is transing or transgendering. I hear some version of that quite often. And I think it's just because that word is so close to the word transgender that they're not don't quite have a grasp on that word, so it just takes some practice. It's important to understand the language to use when you're talking about somebody who's transgender and that has transitioned, that oftentimes we'll hear things like that they used to be, like they used to be a girl and now they want to be a boy, and that's really not appropriate language, because what they're telling you in terms of the need for the transition is that they have been a boy the whole time. In their brain, it's just that their body doesn't match. And so the correct terminology is talking about the sex that someone was assigned at birth. That doesn't mean that that's who they are, and it doesn't mean that that's who their gender identity is, but that's the sex they were assigned at birth. And that just becomes a fact that happened. You're not making any judgments about it, and nobody's stuck with that. It just happens to be the sex they were assigned at birth. And so then someone is something else. So they were assigned male at birth, but they identify as a woman. They are a woman. They were just assigned male at birth. And the human condition not being binary. So we already talked about this a little bit in the very beginning in terms of thinking about all the things that make up our human condition. So we have eye color, hair color, skin color, body shape, all of those things. And I would hazard a guess that no one can tell me in terms of a living person part of our human condition that's only exists on a binary, meaning there's exactly and only two options. And so when it comes to orientation and gender identity, it seems kind of silly that a lot of the culture says that there's exactly two and you need to pick one. It doesn't scientifically seem to make much sense when nothing else about our human condition exists that way. When we know better, we do better is the phrase I borrow from Oprah. And so in talking about this topic, oftentimes it's important to reflect upon what we did to other groups of people when we misunderstood part of their human condition. So for example, what did we do with left-handed kids for generations? We told them that they were lazy and stubborn and they could just get right, figure out how to write the quote-unquote right way. That everything would be easier and the world would be smooth. And then after all those generations and we annihilated their self-esteem, we realized, oops, sorry. Guess we didn't realize that handedness is just part of our human condition, and there, are multiple ways to be handed and footed as well. And then another analogy would be our discovery or our realization of learning differences. That the same thing was done to those kiddos that have learning differences. They were told that they were less than, that they were lazy and stubborn, and if they tried harder, they could read the right way, when in reality, they just learned differently. And so after we annihilated several generations, multiple generations of learning differences, and we're not all better, but we're a little bit better, we now understand, human condition in terms of how we learn is very different. And we have an autism spectrum we didn't understand. And we have things like ADD and ADHD that we didn't understand or recognize, and now do, and now understand that if we can figure out and diagnose that we really can help those folks, and they're perfectly capable of participating fully in society and actually making our society much better, because they think outside the box and aren't such linear thinkers as those of us on this call might tend to be as lawyers. So that's, I guess, my hope in terms of this conversation, is that when we're learning about something else about our human condition, that we not have to start back at zero. Can we make the learning curve a little shorter? Can we just understand that there's difference and that's just part of our humanity? So when we look at the terms, it's important to understand that they're not all interchangeable. So transgender and your gender identity is not interchangeable with intersex. The same way that your gender identity or being transgender has nothing to do with your orientation. There are differences in terms of the average age that we realize our orientation and our gender identity. So all of the current research in terms of orientation is that we have some sense of that at about the age, on average, of about the age of 10. But the American Academy of Pediatrics says that we have a firm sense of our gender between the ages of 3 and 5. So that tells us generally that we know who we are long before we know who we like. Pre-op, post-op, non-op is a conversation about somebody's operational status. Do you want surgery? Are you getting surgery? Have you thought about it? Do you want it? Do you not want it? And the bottom line about that, in terms of asking folks that you aren't close to or you don't have some kind of legal reason to know that, comes from my teenagers, and it's the none ya rule, but it's none ya business. Because it really doesn't matter. And when you understand what it is to be transgender, you understand that it exists in your brain, whether or not you ever do anything about it, and whether or not you ever want to do anything about it. And so by boiling down everybody's transgender litmus test as to whether or not they have or want surgery is really disingenuous to the whole concept of being transgender, because the being transgender does not automatically come with a need or a desire for some kind of surgery, and it also doesn't mean that there aren't people who want it that don't have access. And so the bottom line is just none of your business. Queer and questioning. So queer, for those of you who are over the age of about 35, aren't really too fond of that word, and that still can be true. But it's important that if you're working with younger folks, you understand that there are more and more of them that are identifying as queer, and they're doing it for a couple of reasons. One is they don't want you to just have stereotypes about them. That if they come out as gay and your only reference is Jack from Will and Grace, God love him, but does not represent every gay guy on the planet. Or the same way that Wanda Sykes and Ellen DeGeneres don't represent every lesbian on the planet. And so identifying as queer is kind of combating some of those stereotypes that folks have when somebody comes out. And the other reason is that you might have multiple intersecting identities, and in all of the graphs that we talked about. And so particularly if you live in Nebraska, you spend 20 minutes explaining that to folks every time you come out, or is it easier to just use the umbrella term of queer? Very important couple other things about the term queer, though. One is that it's still a self-identifier. So people are still going to be describing their lived experience as queer. You don't want to impose that identity on anybody else who hasn't already identified that way. And the second thing is that it tends to be generational. So there's a lot more younger folks that are embracing that term in terms of their self-identity, but there's a lot of older folks who want no part of it. So it's really important to still be careful, because it's not always an affirming term still. And then questioning, just to point out the fact that if somebody's questioning, it does not mean they're sitting down and doing a pros and cons list of deciding whether or not they're going to be part of this community. The bottom line is they either are or they aren't. But whether they're 5, 15, or 55, they have absorbed a whole bunch of stereotypes about what it is to be LGBTQ. And at some point, if you think, that might be me, it might take them a little while to unpack all of that and to sort it all out and to figure out where they are and how they identify and when and if they're ready to tell the rest of the world. So somebody identifying this question is not deciding whether or not they're part of the LGBTQ community. They're just deciding how they fit in, where they fit in, and when they're comfortable sharing that with the world, which can be different for everybody. So when you talk about some of the identity documents that are important to us, particularly as lawyers, and I know everybody practices in a different area, so I'm certainly open. You can email me about any of your areas of law that you have particular questions about, and if I don't have or know the resource, I will get it for you. But in general, in terms of passports in particular, you can now change, since 2010, you can change the gender marker on your passport and no surgery is required. So it still needs a letter from a physician that you've undergone, that the person has undergone the clinical treatment necessary for the transition, but there's no surgery requirements any longer, at least at this point in time. And then in terms of the Nebraska DMV, there is a form also allowing changes in the gender marker without surgery, and that's a form that a treating physician can sign. And then in terms of Nebraska birth certificates, so we have two issues. One is a name change and one is a gender marker change. And in terms of the name change, if a person's born before 2005, unfortunately, and I'm not quite sure why, but the old name is crossed out and the new name is typed above it. If a person's born after 2005, the new name just replaces the old name on the birth certificate. Not sure why there's a distinction there. However, if you get to the point where you're changing your gender marker in Nebraska, then even if you're born before 2005, you'll get a name replacement, as your name's going to be replaced instead of the cross out as well. When it comes to changing your gender marker in Nebraska, it still requires a notarized letter from the physician performing the surgery. And that's very particular, meaning that I've had folks call and say that they've gone to, say, Thailand to get their surgery and they have a letter, but it's not notarized. They cannot go to another physician here in Nebraska and have them have a notarized letter saying, yep, looks like a penis, yep, looks like a vagina. That doesn't work, unfortunately. They have to send those letters back to Thailand and pay what's kind of an inordinate amount for a notarization of that letter. So if you ever have any clients that are planning to go to surgery, just make sure that they know that that letter from the physician has to be notarized by the physician. It has to be a letter from the physician performing the surgery. Really important little tidbit that not everybody picks up before they leave. So before we finish, and certainly I'm still open to any questions you might have, I was going to share our story so that you understood from a family perspective kind of what can happen and what families go through. And so I will now briefly share our story. And it's important to note I've had disclaimers on every page that none of the PowerPoint can be copied or reproduced without permission. And then what's following is our child's art, and that's all been copyrighted. So the same rule applies in terms of her art, that it should not be reproduced in any way without prior written permission. So with that, I will proceed. My husband and I thought we had 3 boys until our middle child, whom we named Ben, was about 18 months or 2 years old, and started to rifle through the kitchen drawers to find towels to fashion into long hair or pin into skirts. And everything about this kiddo was feminine. So the cartoons and movies and toys, everything that he was attracted to, we used to call them girl things, that they would be feminine. And so this went on for several years at our house with just that's what he likes to play with, and we didn't think much more of it. We didn't know anything about gender identity, so we made the assumption that we were raising the gayest boy on the planet, if that was possible. Because we'd never met any boy more feminine than our kiddo. And so when it got closer to the time for school, we decided that we didn't really want to tell him that the things that he thought and were attracted to and liked to play with and all of those things were wrong or bad. And so that maybe if he was an early October birthday, maybe if we sent him to kindergarten twice, once at the public school, a little early, then we could send him to kindergarten again at the parochial school where his older brother was, and he could spend that first year of kindergarten kind of sorting out how far you can push that gender envelope and what things are kids going to make fun of and all of those kind of gender expectations. And so this is one of the pieces of art from that first year through kindergarten where he writes, "I enjoy playing with my Barbie diary because I like to write." Or this one, my favorite Christmas present was Fairy Wishes Dora. And this was the last one from that first year of kindergarten. My task is putting my princess blanket away. In case you missed the blonde lots, to make sure you know that we live there. So after that first year of kindergarten, when he was about to start kindergarten again at the parochial school, where we assumed he would be for 9 years, that was the first time we reached out and really demanded some help with a counselor. Before that, his pediatrician had continued to say that it was a phase and that he would outgrow it. And we knew from living with him day in and day out, and at this point, he was 5, so this had been 3 years in our house every single day, that it was more than a phase. Something was going on. We weren't sure what it was or what it meant for us or for him, but something was going on. And we had really wanted some help in sorting it out. And so that summer, we went to our first psychiatrist and psychologist, and their consensus was that he did meet all of the criteria for gender identity disorder, but at his young age, they didn't want to diagnose him. And so the advice basically was to let him drive the bus. I'll tell you what he needs and when, and then kind of send us on our way to sit in that ambiguity for a while. which we did because we didn't know any better and didn't know what else to do. So during that first year of kindergarten at the parochial school, this is one of the pieces of art, is draw yourself with Jesus, and he draws himself pink with blue bows and pigtails. And then in first grade, draw yourself as a firefighter, and was outside of the lines provided to draw long hair. And then I went out of town, and this was waiting for me when I got home, and so drawing himself as a boy, but that's the princess that's really on the inside. And then around Valentine's Day of first grade, they worked on pen pal letters, and this was his pen pal letter going supposedly to Kimball, Nebraska. So he draws himself as a boy, and then his girl shadow with long hair, and says, "It's my girl soul." And the pen pal letter was, "Dear pen pal, my name is Ben Stacy. I'm a boy girl. I'm 7. My birthday is October 2nd. When's yours?" So his amazing teacher said, "I think that's a little personal for the first letter," but saved it for me for parent-teacher conferences. And it was around a few months after this that towards the end of first grade, kind of in that summer in between first and second grade, that we decided as a family that we would start calling her Kate, which is the name she picked, and use female pronouns. And so for a while, we were using both. So we would use the boy name and boy pronouns when we were out in public, and her real name and pronouns when we were at home. And so that's how we existed, kind of particularly for that summer. And so there were lots of before and after photo or self-portraits and self-portraits as mermaid, and some quick ones on the back of our vocabulary sheet that's sitting around home. So at the summer before second grade, we saw a counselor again, and this was a gal that specialized in gender identity issues with kiddos. And she was really insistent that she needed to transition and that it was really important for her. And so we were trying to figure out what to do and how to approach the school and whether or not she could transition when she was. And so I was supposed to go up to school and talk to them. And so knowing what that might mean for our family, I put it off, as I think a lot of families would, knowing that it was kind of turning over a rock that we couldn't undo. And so I didn't do it fast enough. She ended up getting in trouble one day at recess, and when she was sent to the counselor, she told her basically that I'm a girl on the inside and I want to come to school as myself, and I'm wondering where I can get a skirt. So that counselor was wise enough to just say, "I think I'm going to call your mom." And she did, and we did some training with her outside private counselor, trained the counselors at the school. And at first, the counselors and the teachers were very supportive, and this is one of the things they worked on at the beginning of second grade then, after she had disclosed, and that's that when I feel angry when someone calls me a boy, and when she's angry, her heart beats fast, and to feel better, she screams into her pillow. Another one of those guidance worksheets, ways to calm down when you're upset. And so she draws herself as a boy and says it's the disguise of Ben, and then draws herself as a girl and says not the disguise of Ben, but the real name is Kate. And currently writing a book, So Tough Life to Easy Life, where she draws herself as a boy and then as a girl. And so as the school year wore on, so did their patients, and at some point they were told by the higher ups in the church that she would not be allowed to transition, and that they uninvited her to third grade and some other, we'll say, springtime activities that happen for second graders. And they were also then told that they could no longer speak to us. And so we were sending our kids to school every day without any communication back, which is pretty terrifying. And so we had thought at the time, and this was in 2009, before a lot of folks had come out, that have come out since then, that have made even the term transgender more publicly aware. We decided that educating folks was really the only way we could make this community safer for Kate. And because of my law license, I can't pick up and start a private practice in some other state. And so we needed to try to do what we could in our community. So anonymously, we went to the local media, and there was an article in the World Herald, and there was a couple of news stories on the local Channel 7 ABC station. Unfortunately, one of my friends, thinking that more people needed to be educated about it, sent it to a friend at CNN, and once it got on CNN's website, without asking us, it was then picked up by local affiliates, ABC affiliates all across the country. And then it went international. So at that point, we were a little nervous in terms of her physical safety because we had no idea what was going to happen, or who, wanted a picture of her, or to expose us or her. And so we ended up making a decision, because we weren't having any communication with the school, that we would pull her out of school a couple of days early. I think it was 3 days early, from the end of that school year. And that day she worked on this piece of art. And so I said, well, gosh, Kate, what's that? And she said, I just always want to remember the day I got to be myself. And so at first I loved that piece of art because she looks so happy. But then the lawyer in me kicks in, and I start to cross-examine it and think, well, wait a minute. She had really been herself every place but school for almost a whole year at that point. And so what we had to realize is that if you're asking somebody to compartmentalize who they are, where they are, that they're not really themselves. And that people have to be themselves in every area of their life if they're going to thrive and be happy. And that was kind of a hard lesson for us, as we had spent a year kind of faltering around trying to figure out how to best care for her and to get her needs met. And we were really putting the adults ahead of her and what her needs were. And so I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Pride Players at the Rose, but it's an LGBTQ allied youth theater improv group that meets every year. And Kate did that for 4 years. And what it is they get educated about LGBTQ issues and what issues are affecting them as LGBTQ and allied youth in the Omaha Metro. And they make up little, like, Saturday Night Live-ish skits about what it is to be LGBTQ or allied youth in the area. And then they do that for a few months, and then they whittle them down to their favorite ones. And then sprinkled in amidst these funny skits are certain kiddos' monologues. And it can either be about their coming out or whatever they're going through at the time. And so this is Kate's monologue from her freshman year in high school.
Hi, I'm Kate, and this is my story. When you first enter this world, what's the first thing spoken to you? It's not, what is your pronouns, or how do you identify? No, it's blatant accusation of, it's a boy, or it's a girl! You're shoved into a box even before being placed in your parents' arms. From the moment I set foot on this earth, I knew that the stereotypes and identifications being placed on me weren't right. I knew who I was, but the rest of the world didn't seem to care. I'm transgender, which means I was biologically male at birth. However, my brain, personality, and interests are predominantly female. Now, this may seem very simple to my mind, to others that is not the case. I was kicked out of my own private school for being transgender after second grade. Second grade. And then my mom had a surgery that was safer in your school for me to go to. Through executive bathroom issues and your emails and phone calls, we finally found a school that took me in only a few weeks before the school year started. And I thought it was a daydream. A school that accepts me for me, and that's it? This can't be real. But it was real. I was finally away from all the ignorance in my last school. And although part of me is terrified of what might happen during my high school years, the other bigger part of me is just happy that I've had a family who's stuck with me throughout everything that's happened. Because they don't live on a binary system of male and female. And they don't define me by my past. They only care about the safety of my future. Because that's what true love by anyone feels. Accepting someone no matter what. No questions asked.
So that's a little snapshot of her after all of that art. And here she is today. She's finishing up her junior year in high school. And just because you can't have too much fun in one family, our youngest, who's 14, identifies as gay. So we have quite the rainbow at our house. And so I hope through both sharing our family story and the education piece that came first, that you really are able to come to the point where you can appreciate all of the fabulousness that is the gray in this world, and that the world is not black and white, nor is our humanity, and that's okay. That really is what makes us amazing. And I hope that you're open to helping and serving LGBTQ clients a little bit more than you were when you started. And if you need any other information or you have any other questions for me, we've got about 6 minutes before the end of the time that I'm open to any questions that you have. And if you have them, please ask. And if you don't have them right now, make sure that feel free to email me or call me at any time. And I will do whatever I can to help any other questions you may have. And this is a reminder, you can ask those questions by typing them in the chat. Okay, so the first question is, do you have any recommended resources for employment lawyers on the topic? So National Center for Transgender Equality has some pretty good information. They've done quite a bit of work with trans folks in particular. I'm trying to think of any other particular employment ones. I can certainly refer you or send you the current case law. I don't know if that's kind of what you're talking about, both with EEOC and in terms of federal court cases that are either pending or have been recently decided. And those are, as you likely know, associated with Title VII, and whether or not orientation and gender identity is covered under Title VII under sex. And the general consensus by the federal court has been yes, that it does fall under that category of sex. Perfect. So she's talking about best practices. I have a lot of ideas for that, and some resources, and some of those come from, ironically, the federal government, like OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, has a great guide in terms of transitioning employees and what you need to provide for them. So that would be, I think, a good resources that we're looking for. Any other questions? Okay, I don't really see any other questions, so unless you're a speedy typer by the time we wrap up. Otherwise, again, feel free to email me either at the email that's on the screen, which is js@jonistacy.com, or you can certainly find me in the bar directory, and I don't care how those emails come in, or you can certainly call me. Office number is 402-884-7444. And I really appreciate your time, and I hope that you feel a little bit better about the puzzle pieces than you did when you started. And again, if you need any resources or you have any follow-up questions, it certainly doesn't even have to be this week. I'm not going anywhere. So I appreciate your time. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.